co-chair of the MFA Designer as Author program and the author of over 100 books. This is one of his lectures in the Paul Rand Lecture Series.
Anybody who tells you logo design is easy is lying, or they've never done it. Logo design is very difficult. Trying to embody the ideas of an individual, of a company, trying to make a product representative of one particular image is not easy at all. And what's more, refinement of a logo is probably the hardest thing a designer can do. I'm going to show you the work of a brilliant designer. His name is Wilhelm Defke, and he ran a company in Germany in the 20s and 30s called Wilhelm Werk. He created some of the first modern logos, reductive logos. Some of them you'll see in this presentation are familiar, some of them are not. What you will see are logos that are unadorned, that are simple, direct, and powerful. So let's look at those logos. The modern corporate logo was born in Germany shortly after the turn of the century, the direct descendant of burgher crests, coats of arms, trade and factory marks. In the 1920s, members of the Bauhaus and the Ring Neue Werbgestalter, the circle of new advertising designers, were given credit for inventing the reductive trademark. But this modern method actually began well over a decade earlier. Official German government registry books from the early 1900s were full of Schutzmarken, or trademarks, by Peter Behrens, the father of corporate design for AEG, Lucien Bernhard, F.H. Emke, Konrad Jochheim, Karl Schulpig, and Valentin Ziatara. Each created pictograms and graphic trade characters that prefigured today's international sign symbols. One of the most prolific of these mark makers is barely recognized in design histories today, except for the occasional footnote. His name is Wilhelm F. Defke, co-founder with Karl Ernst Hinkelfuss of Wilhelm Werk in Berlin. Each created pictograms and graphic trade characters that prefigured today's international sign symbols. Included among Wilhelm Defke's prolific output, which began in the early teens, he either originated or modernized dozens of the era's most impressive symbols for commerce and government, not the least of which became the most charged logo of the 20th century, the Hakenkreuz, the hooked cross or swastika, prior to its adoption by the Nazis. When Defke tackled this ancient sign in the late teens, he never intended that it be used as a political symbol, no less one with such evil consequence. Quote, Defke came across a representation of the ancient Germanic sun wheel on which he worked to redefine and stylize this shape, wrote his former assistant, Mana Tress, in a letter to Paul Rand during the 1970s. Later on, she said, this symbol appeared on a brochure which he had published, and the Nazis chose it as their symbol, but they reversed it. Her primary reason for writing this letter was apparently to absolve Defke of any responsibility for the creation of the Nazi icon. And furthermore, she implied, the swastika was taken from his self-published sample book of trademarks and never paid for. Defke was well aware that the mark in rectilinear and curvilinear variations was more or less in the public domain. He simply intended to render a cleaner version that was more geometrically precise than the others. Defke, incidentally, was not an ideological Nazi, but in the struggle of signs in the Weimar Republic and the Journal of History, Sherwin Simmons cites documents that show in 1933, when the Magdeburg school where Defke taught was threatened with closure, he joined the Nazi Party and argued for modern design's link to Nazi policy on account of the party's technological sophistication and opposition to narrow provincialism. Precision guided Defke's practice at every turn. In 1909, he worked for the leading design precisionist, Peter Behrens, and watched as he built up the Allgemeine Elektrizitätsgesellschaft, the AEG, through the concerted integration of graphics, product design, and architecture. Defke learned that a pure mark void of superfluous ornamentation could communicate directly with the public like few other business tools. So after leaving Bernhardt's employ, Defke became design consultant to Otto Eisler Verlag, where he focused on developing the firm's identity. In 1915, he opened Wilhelm Work, yet also assumed an active role promoting the virtues of design to public and profession through self-published books and portfolios that evidenced the highest graphic standards. Defke prided himself on how reductive he could make a symbol while remaining comprehensible and memorable. He preferred working with primitive and abstract forms because they were malleable, and his knack for manipulating them into forceful marks was quite acute. This eye, of course, was well before the CBS eye. Defke created a large number of marks for the post-war German military, which during the early days of the Weimar Republic sought to change its public image from reliance on trappings associated with haughty Junkers to a more modern one, while retaining its authoritarian persona. He was also called upon to design government propaganda. Defke understood that German industry's identity needs prior to World War I demanded a new kind of comprehensible mnemonic symbol. The introduction by 1906 of the proto-modernist Sackplakat, or object poster, created by Lucien Bernhard, which reduced an advertising message down to one memorable object or icon, a response to the rise in urban traffic and limited visibility on the thoroughfares, was critical in moving commercial art away from Rococo complexity to unornamented economy. Defke, who in 1910 taught trademark design at the Reimann School in Berlin, and years later was appointed the director of the Kunstgewerbeschule in Magdeburg, could clearly see in only a few short years the German public had become accustomed to witty little icons. Schutzmarken in general followed a fairly strict stylistic formula. They were stark silhouettes, usually with basic geometrical attributes. A round head on a rectangular body was common, as were triangles and parallelograms, and visual puns were encouraged. The modern trademark was promoted to designers and their clients through the magazine Das Plakat, which was launched in 1910 as the official journal of the Friends of the Poster Society, and later by Gebrauchsgrafik, founded in 1923, which became the leading international graphic design and advertising journal. Both periodicals sought to expand the designer's role in business, and Defke was one of the more outspoken proponents of this early approach to corporate identification. He once said, "Trademarks acquire their real worth and significance only through adequate usage." He sermonized often. It is not sufficient to use them once in a while to designate certain products. They must be used systematically and frequently. The trademark, he said, will be the most likely to establish an inseparable bond between the user and the manufacturer. While Defke was an unapologetic cheerleader for his profession and his own business interests, he was no less a critic. He once wrote, "Most modern marks are lacking in artistic merit and significance. Their shapes are average and bland, ugly and utilitarian." He also wrote, "Their designers misunderstand their purpose, leading to a kind of useless playfulness. This, in turn, harms the reputation of these marks and makes them difficult to use universally. It should be obvious to anyone that creating these marks is best left to professionals with experience, practice, and the artistic strength to make them unique." You can almost hear him speaking in heavy German tones. Defke's sermonizing was a textbook example of the new art of strategic design. The trademark, he said, will forge an indestructible link between producer and consumer, which will successfully ward off any unfair competition. Yet aside from having practical advantages, trademarks are of great importance, he noted, for all creative entrepreneurs who wish to display the fruits of their minds and inventions to the world now and in the future. Trademarks remain forever in our memory and so display some of the characteristics usually associated with great works of art. Such a zealous logo designer was prone to overstatement. Here's another one of his statements. If a trademark is created by competent hands, it will gain in importance, as it, in conjunction with other advertising means, reappears in ads in newspapers and magazines, business papers and brochures, on factory walls, vans, and trucks. As a result, it will impress itself indelibly on people's minds. These are some of the images that he produced for a variety of corporations, business, and military concerns. Some have a very harsh and Prussian look. Others are more lighthearted. The greatest marks, he says, in typical self-promotional tones, are created by that talented home of German workmanship, the Wilhelm work, with rare talent and thoroughness. Some of those marks were quite abstract. Some of those marks were based on letter forms. And many of those marks were based on aesthetic principles that were designed to draw the mind and keep a mental cookie in the user's head. The simplicity of his marks are what made his customers come back and back to him. The elegance of his marks is what sets them aside from more crass mark makers. The humor in his marks brought the consumer as well as the manufacturer to his door. And some of his marks were very clear. Logos were endemic to industry's success, and make no mistake, he said, my logos were the tools to achieve it.